Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a seriously fascinating Native American mythological mystery. I mean, if you love a good detective story where geography, history, and ancient beliefs all just kind of collide to reveal something entirely unexpected, well, you are in the exact right place. So let's get right to it.
Think about this for a second. What exactly connects a sacred, gushing spring, a terrifying 19th century steamboat that was literally designed for psychological warfare, and massive prehistoric bones hidden deep in the mud of the American Midwest? That is the core mystery we're unpacking today. And if you follow the evidence with me, I promise you a highly satisfying reveal that is going to completely change how you look at ancient storytelling. Okay, let's dive into this. To really get this story, we've got to rewind a bit and look at how ancient indigenous peoples across the Americas interpreted their origins and their environments. First, consider emergence myths. This was a huge belief system across the continent. Take the ancestral Aztecs, for example. It was said they emerged from 7 caves, right? This is a very natural outgrowth of the belief that humans were literally earth-born, coming from deep underground. Now, contrast that with hydromythology, which is a totally different category based around crucial water resources. Think of the Mayans. Their whole civilization depended on this intricate network of groundwater. In cultures like that, water isn't just something you drink, it's this profound, active spiritual force that shapes literally everything.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. When people hear about Native American aquatic myths in the northern U.S., their minds almost always jump to one famous name, Hiawatha. But we really need to set the record straight here. Hiawatha was actually an Iroquois cultural hero who lived in pre-Columbian New York, around the year 1450. Thanks to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's super-famous 1855 poem, Hiawatha got strongly associated with Minnehaha Falls in Minnesota. But actually, scratch that, he is absolutely not Minnesota's primary aquatic myth. So we're going to set him aside today and focus strictly on the genuine local indigenous mythology of the Dakota people.
To understand that specific Dakota mythology, we've got to define a really crucial word, Huacan. It translates roughly to mysterious. When early Christian missionaries like Gideon Pond showed up in the 1830s, they recorded that the Dakota viewed their landscape as incredibly active. It was alive. Bubbling springs of water weren't just everyday geological features to them, they were literally described as the breathing places of the Huacan. This is absolutely crucial for us today, because it helps us see how they viewed the earth not just as static rock and water, but as the active dwelling place of powerful, mysterious spirits.
Which brings us to the centerpiece of our explainer today. Section 1. Unktahe, God of the Waters.
Unktahe was the subterranean and subaquatic deity of the Dakota. We're talking a force of creation, a patron of medicine men, and a figure of immense and honestly sometimes terrifying power that ruled the watery worlds. And this deity's presence was tied to very real, tangible places in the landscape, like Camp Coldwater Spring. Picture this. This spring gushed an astonishing 60 gallons of water every single minute straight out of the Platteville limestone. It provided beautifully cold, clear drinking water, which, was a very welcome alternative to the warm, muddy Mississippi River right nearby. It was so essential that it's often called the birthplace of Minnesota. But to the Dakota people, its significance went way, way deeper than just being a reliable water source. Just listen to this statement from a 1998 affidavit filed by Gary Cavender, a local Native American spiritual leader. He stated, "The spring is the site of our creation myth and the beginning of Indian existence on Earth. Our underwater god lives in the spring." He actually goes on in that affidavit to point out that the sacredness of the spring is obvious because it never freezes over, and you can always see activity bubbling right beneath the surface. I mean, this beautifully illustrates the enduring, modern-day sacred impact of Camp Coldwater. This belief in the undergods isn't just a dusty piece of history, it's a living, breathing spiritual connection to the land.
In fact, Unktahe was fundamentally credited with creating the earth itself. The historian Edward Duffield Neal recounted the Dakota's fascinating earth diver creation myth, and it's centered entirely on this god. It basically plays out in 3 steps. First, Unktahe acts as this grand creator, assembling all the aquatic tribes into a huge conclave. Second, he orders them to dive down and bring up dirt from beneath the waters to form the dry land. And third, and this is wild, to show his absolute, undeniable authority, he proclaims death to anyone who disobeys. So yeah, he's a creator, for sure, but a fiercely demanding one.
Moving right along to Section 2, Encounters and Sacrifices.
Living alongside the physical domain of a demanding subterranean water god meant that human interactions with Unktahe were dramatic, deeply reverent, and occasionally totally fatal. Historically, we can see just how embedded Unktahe was in the region for everyone who lived there. Back in 1680, early explorers Hennepin and Duluth actually saw beautiful buffalo robes hanging right at St. Anthony Falls. These were direct sacrifices made to the water god. Fast forward to 1819, and Major Long's military expedition is navigating these exact same highly charged waters. And then, tragically, in 1851, Reverend R. Hopkins drowned at Traverse des Sioux. To the Dakota, there was no mystery here. It was universally believed Unktahe killed him specifically because the Reverend had been preaching against the deity. No way around it.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how fearsome a reputation this god had. Gideon Pond documented the belief that Unktahe dwelled in a den of awful dimensions, literally constructed of iron, right under the falls of St. Anthony. The visceral story goes that when the ice broke up and gorged the Mississippi River, it caused this sudden massive flood. A soldier who was just sitting inside a small cabin on the low bank was swept away entirely, never seen again. The worshippers of the god universally believed Unktahe caused the flood while passing down the river, literally plucking the poor soldier up for his evening meal.
But St. Anthony Falls wasn't the only place you had to be careful. Let's look at Carver's Cave over in nearby St. Paul. This was another super prominent local haunt for the subterranean god. A spiritual entity known as the Unktahe was believed to live in the dark lake at the very back of the cave. This belief was so strong and so incredibly localized that even as recently as the 1940s and 50s, elders specifically warned children not to venture too far back into the darkness. The geography of the Twin Cities is literally mapped with the presence of this deity.
Which brings us to Section 3, Serpent, Kraken, or Ox. Now, what's really interesting about this is, if you were to counter this god, what would it actually look like? Are we talking about a serpent, a kraken, or an enormous ox? Because the historical accounts leave us with some seemingly contradictory descriptions. But we can actually map out the shape-shifting nature of the beast depending on the exact location and the story being told. Up top, on the Missouri River, Unktahe is described as a giant serpent or fish. Down in Lake Pepin, the accounts sound much more like a massive kraken-like monster straight out of European folklore. And in the deep waters and great waterfalls, Unktahe takes the form of an immense ox with horns that can extend all the way up to the skies. Let's break these specific encounters down a bit.
First, that serpent imagery. Believe it or not, it was actually weaponized by the U.S. military. During Major Stephen Long's 1819 expedition, they launched a steamboat officially named the Western Engineer, but everyone quickly dubbed it Long's Dragon. This thing was designed specifically as primitive psychological warfare. They gave the bow of the boat a black, reptilian head with a red mouth and a protruding tongue. It literally belched smoke and steam from its gaping jaws. And get this, they even hid the paddle wheels out of sight so the boat would create a foaming wake. It looked exactly like a massive swimming serpent, smoking with fatigue as it carried the boat on its back. The military cynically exploited the local mythology to terrify the indigenous tribes along the river.
Meanwhile, over in Lake Pepin, the encounters were equally terrifying but totally different in form. One story relates how a group of Indians suddenly found themselves aground in the middle of the lake during a massive storm. Turns out, their god had risen to the surface, lifting them and their entire canoe completely out of the water on its massive back. The monster then began to slowly beat a drum that sounded like thunder, while its eyes glistened like two huge moons in the dark. It's an incredibly dramatic scene, right? It builds massive tension and perfectly illustrates the sheer, unimaginable scale of this water god.
All right, we are ready for our final act, Section 4, the fossil connection.
So, the crucial point is, we have a giant swimming serpent, an enormous kraken lifting canoes, and an immense ox. How do we possibly reconcile all these massive, terrifying shapes? Well, here's the twist, and it is a real game changer. These mythological monsters were actually based on the very real discovery of Ice Age megafauna fossils hidden in the wetlands. The Dakota people weren't just making monsters up out of thin air. They were finding real, prehistoric bones of unimaginable size buried right there in the mud.
Think about a mammoth. To someone who has never seen an elephant, it perfectly resembles the descriptions of an enormous ox, right? Well, the fossilized bones of mammoths and mastodons have been found all throughout Minnesota. The Dakota prize these bones highly for their magical powers, carefully preserving them as relics in medicine bags. I mean, think about the brilliant logic here. Because these massive bones were found exclusively in low, wet places like riverbeds and bogs, and because literally no one had ever seen such an animal walking around on land, the Dakota logically deduced that these must be the remains of giant, subaquatic gods whose dwelling was in the water. It is a stunning example of ancient scientific deduction, all wrapped up inside a theological framework.
And this deduction isn't just an American phenomenon either. Take a look at the definition of the word mammoth itself. It actually derives from a Finno-Ugric word meaning earth mole. Why? Because ancient peoples in Siberia found these exact same massive remains buried deep in the permafrost. They logically assumed the bones belonged to a giant burrowing animal that lived completely underground. It's this fascinating global parallel of ancient peoples interpreting massive buried bones as evidence of subterranean creatures. It's like a giant puzzle they were piecing together.
And the thing is, these bones didn't just explain what was under the earth and water, they helped explain what was happening up in the sky, too. As the Scottish folklorist Lewis Spence theorized, Unktahe, the water god and cunning sorcerer, was believed to be in constant violent strife with Wakion, the thunderbird. Sometimes it was believed the mastodon bones they found were actually the remains of an Unktahe that the thunderbird had struck down and killed from above. This constant mythological battle beautifully symbolized the violent, dramatic atmospheric changes that accompany the shifting of the seasons in the Midwest. So, what does this all mean? It leaves us with this final, really profound question. How many of our most ancient, terrifying myths are actually just prehistoric science waiting to be rediscovered in the mud? When we look closely at stories like Unktahe and the sacred springs of Minnesota, we aren't just looking at old fairy tales. We are looking at the incredible intersection of indigenous storytelling, deep geological geography, and real-life paleontology. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today. Keep asking questions about the world around you, and I will see you on the next explainer.